Hello to everybody who's joined this Pretty River Dyke Maintenance Project Q&A. My name is Maria Lung, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority. I will be moderating this meeting today. On behalf of the Town of Collingwood and NVCA, I'd like to welcome you to the Pretty River Dyke Maintenance Project Q&A. We're going to start the meeting with a short presentation from Mark Hartley, our NVCA's senior engineer, followed by answering your questions you have about the Pretty River Dyke, our maintenance project. So before we begin, here are a few things to remember for the meeting. This meeting is currently being recorded, so it can be shared later for the residents who did not get to join this meeting or have missed answers to the questions. And to ensure the flow of the meeting, please type your question into the chat. Only selected NVCA and Town of Collingwood staff will have the ability to turn on their microphone. We will only answer the same question once. So for example, if there are two questions about, tell me about the Pretty River Dyke, we will only respond to the instance where it is asked first. And only please stick to the topic and ask questions about the Pretty River Dyke, the maintenance project, or flooding in Collingwood. If we weren't able to answer your question, please email your questions to flood@nvca.on.ca. Mark, did you want to do your presentation?
Yep, will do. Just let me share the screen. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us to give us this opportunity to take a few minutes to present to you some information about the Pretty River Dyke Maintenance Project. In the town of Collingwood, with the 5 water courses going through the town, namely, you might be familiar with Silver Creek in the far the west part of town, and Black Ash Creek in Pretty River falling to the middle of town, and then the Bateau on the far east side of town. So those water courses and just the nature of how they respond to a rain event tends to sort of make Collingwood a little bit vulnerable to flooding. And so over the years, we've got some photographs from the Collingwood Museum that you may have seen in various media forms. In 1912, for example, there was a photograph of Market Lane being flooded, and then in 1942, Hume Street, which is quite close to the Pretty River Dyke. And then what's interesting is that there's a news article that was written in July of 1958, and the quote was that by 11 p.m. of that night, the Pretty River, as they say, bust loose for a Saturday night in the town, and that at the peak of the flood, that Collingwood was flooded with up to 2 feet of water. So that's quite the problem. And interestingly enough, just shortly after that event in 1958, so into the late 60s, planning started for trying to find some solutions to solve this flooding problem, because it's quite, it's just all that the water in the streets, it just makes it particularly problematic for the residents and the businesses in the town. So one of the pieces of flood control infrastructure that was considered at that time was something called a dike. So if you take a look at the graphic on the top right corner, the dike is these mounds of earth on either side of a river, of a water course, shown in the blue arrows, with the idea that when that particular river floods, that or receives a flood event, the water can actually come to the top of the dike, as shown by that blue graphic, and it's keeping the lands on either side of the dike dry. And so that's one sort of type of flood control structure. And so that was the one that was built in the mid-70s for the Pretty River corridor. And you can see an aerial photograph in the bottom of this slide that shows what the Pretty River Dyke system looked like just shortly after construction, and the river and the street or road running through the middle of that photograph is the Pretty River Parkway. So you can see sort of Georgian Bay in the background of the photo, and then you can see the Pretty River Dyke proper. Showing up in this particular photograph, admittedly, is a bit of a moonscape with all that white rock that's lining the dike. And certainly that view has changed over the years. So what's happened is that the vegetation essentially has taken hold. With the dike and the way it was built, it was an earth core, sort of mound, as if you recall from the graphic, but the lining or the covering of the dike and the slope of the dike was a very coarse rock. But what it did is there were spaces between that rock, and it basically allowed seeds to fall into plants to establish in various forms, trees, shrubs, and trees and what have you. And what's happened over the years is those trees have grown and become quite large. And the problem with those trees growing on the slope of the dike is that it holds back the floodwaters. And so it causes it reduces the capacity of the dike to convey the flood flows. And so what happens is that the map on the right and the blue hatching represents the flood inundation or the flood waters as they would look during this regulatory flood event. As you can see going through town. And the graphic, you can see where it's labeled as sections 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's the Pretty River Dyke. And you can see by the purple arrow just coming out of section 5, that's essentially what we predict is going to happen or would happen for the regulatory flood event with all these trees that are in place and sort of holding back the waters. That basically the dike is going to spill over its banks, and that purple arrow was indicating how the waters are going to flow down into the downtown. So what we're needing to do is to sort of get this dike back to into a maintained condition that it functions as a flood conveyance system. But in this day and age, we recognize that there needs to be a balance between its function as a flood conveyance system and providing some form of habitat and recreation, as we've identified with the trail. So what we're proposing to do is we need to manage that vegetation that's on the slopes, and we're proposing to do it into 2 phases. The first phase that we'll be working on starting this fall is to be removing all of or thinning out, if you will, all of the small vegetation along the slopes of the dike. So that includes things like the small shrubs, vines, and what have you through there, and removing all of that material. And so we're going to be doing this work. We're trying to be respective of the habitat that's in there for different species of birds and reptiles and what have you. So we'll be working between August and March. So that's why it's a bit of a late start in this year, so getting into October. And then we're going to try to be respectful of the use of the trail. We know it's valuable to the residents of Collingwood. So we will be trying to keep the work zones as short as possible, and then the time in those work zones as small as possible. And then what we propose to do once these sections are cleaned out, you can get a better idea as to what trees are remaining, is going through what we call phase 2 and going and identifying all of the trees that are remaining, and then coming up with a plan to identify which of those trees do need to come out. And for example, there's a lot of trees there we've identified as ash, and our arborists and forestry staff are telling us that those are sort of hazardous trees with the emerald ash borer, and there's an active program in the town that's looking to address and removing those hazard trees. So there's one example that the trees can be removed. But so we're going to break up this work into 2 phases. So the first phase, just as a reminder, is that no trees will be coming down. It's going in there with a landscape crew, essentially fairly a little bit more labor intensive with small equipment to remove all the small material. And then more importantly, along the banks, the word gets down towards the water's edge, so there'll be no work in the water. And but even down towards the water's edge, we'll be making an effort to maintain the shrubs and grasses that are along the water's edge to provide that habitat. So we recognize that the grasses, so a photograph on the right, top right, is trying to show some of the grasses that are down by the water's edge, sort of late summer. and we recognize that that's important for pollinators and foraging birds. And then the photograph on the bottom left is trying to illustrate on the left water's edge there is this sort of how the shrubs, willows, for example, sandbar willows and other willow species and dogwoods sort of overhang the water's edge and provide some valuable habitat there. So that's the kind of material that we want to preserve. But so you can see these photographs that this is under sort of summer conditions, and you can see the water of the Pretty River flowing past this vegetation. But can you imagine that if the water was considerably higher than what you see in the photograph? So imagine that white line being the water's level. And that's about a close approximation where it would be under this regulatory flood event. And so imagine it being at that height, and that would be quite the spectacle in terms of flooding going through the town, as we witnessed last week with a small flood event. But imagine the water being at that level, and you can sort of see that it's sort of the number of trees and vegetations that is going to be underwater, essentially under those conditions. And it's those are kind of vegetation and that we're trying to manage effectively, that we can provide, as I said, this balance between flood conveyance and protecting the downtown and the neighborhoods within Collingwood to get that flood event through the town without spilling. So the balance between that function as a flood conveyance and then the fish and wildlife habitat. So we're trying to find that balance between the two. So that's essentially what we're trying to achieve. We've sort of established a communication plan that's started essentially sort of a few weeks ago with a stakeholder meeting. And we reached out to folks like the Blue Mountains Watershed Trust, Pollinate Collingwood, Collingwood Climate Action Team, and the Trails Committee to sort of get their perspective on this particular project. There's a media release on the 21st of September, along with launching something called Engage Collingwood, a web page on the Town of Collingwood's website. To communicate what we're doing here and keeping the public up to speed with our activities. An information package went out to Town Council on the 21st as well. There is a mailing that's going out to all the residents, the homes in the Town of Collingwood, and that's sort of in progress. There's going to be a letter and a brochure, a letter describing sort of a bit more, some of the summarizing what we talked about tonight, and a brochure that summarizes the function of the Pretty River Dyke and a few more graphics. We're having this public open session tonight, and then there's social media posts is ongoing, and then we're actually working on putting some signage, building some signs similar to what's there right now if you're walking along the trail, and to be able to communicate the function of the Pretty River Dyke. So that brings you up to speed with some of the highlights of the project, and we look forward to hearing your questions and providing some answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to share my screen. I have I just want to remind everybody to stick to topic when you're asking your questions. And again, please type your question inside the chat. Thank you. We have our first question. If the maintenance has not been happening for the last 20 years, what would be the plan to have it maintained regularly in the future so this does not happen again?
Well, it's a great question. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, it hasn't been maintained for a number of years, and I think what's certainly we are working with the town. Some funds have become available through development processes through the town. So we're taking advantage of those funding opportunities and looking to apply to other sort of provincial funds as they become available. But the goal is that once we get this fairly significant activity completed, is to try to make all efforts to keep the vegetation at a under a bit more of a manageable state every year or every other year as best we can for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Mark. And our next question. So the plan is not to clear cut all of the trees this fall?
Yep, that's right. Yep, this fall we're going to be focusing on, you know, if you walk along the trail sort of north of Moore Bay Park towards Hume Street and the Pretty River Parkway, as you look towards the river, and quite honestly, in many cases, you really can't see the river just because for the dense vegetation. A lot of that's the understory, a lot of vines through there, and just small sort of material, vegetated material that's quite close to the ground. So that's the material that needs to come out. It's going to be using fairly small equipment. You might hear some noise. They're using what we call clearing saws. So it's going to be, you'll hear something if you're in the neighborhood, but it certainly won't be large chainsaws, and you won't be hearing any trees coming down at all this fall. So and there'll just be some folks re-grabbing that material, and you may hear the sound of a chipper from time to time as they chip that material.
Dave, did you want to comment as well?
Yes, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Dave Featherstone. I'm the senior ecologist at the NVCA. I've been involved with this project since about 2006, and there was some, at least some minor clearing that occurred back around 2007 or so. But definitely with the species of trees that are pervasive in the corridor, the ashes, the Manitoba maples, the tree willows, they tend to coppice from their trunks, and you know, definitely more regular maintenance would be helpful in terms of you know, keeping the roughness associated with those trees down long term. Thank you.
So the next question, with the funding, is it possible to consider planting more trees that don't impact the dike on the industry side? We love seeing the river.
Well, thank you for that perspective on seeing the river. You know, I agree. It certainly is a nice corridor. It's great to see sort of both the the natural vegetation side as well, seeing some views of the river. In terms of actually planting trees through that corridor, it's not really the ideal site in terms of planting trees there. Interestingly enough, the NVCA forestry program has planted in the last number of years almost 9,000 or more than 9,000 trees in the Collingwood and Collingwood area. So there is, I would say, an active tree planting program that has been active and continues to be active. So there's, I think, other opportunities that we can look for to plant trees and in other locations, and certainly as close to dike as possible. But our preference would be that they don't actually be so on the river side, because that's kind of the situation that we're trying to avoid the large trees there, especially at the bottom of the slope, because that's what holds back the water.
Thank you, Mark. And then we have this next question. Who is responsible for ensuring that the contractors that are hired do not cut more than necessary? Or what is it that is agreed upon?
Well, we have a contractor who we've retained that has worked with the NVCA for a number of years on many different projects. So they certainly know the staff well. They know Dave and well, and there's another our manager of stewardship, Fred Dobbs. He's worked with him quite closely over the years. So he's a we believe to be a skilled and experienced contractor, and he was the same fellow that did some work for us, as Dave mentioned, in 2007 and 8. And so we're quite confident. And he's actually a Sir Sanford Fleming grad, fish and wildlife technician. So I think he has an appreciation for our overall objective of what needs to come out and what needs to stay. So there's some confidence there. Also, I can share that NVCA staff will be on site on a fairly regular basis, just serving different capacities. And so there'll be an opportunity there to sort of just check to see them, make sure that things are going as planned. And certainly I would suggest that if you have some concerns with respect to what's coming out or what have you, please send us and reach out to us in some way, shape, or form. In particular, sort of sending us an email to the flood at nvca.on.ca address.
Thank you, Mark. Can residents still access the trail while you are doing the work?
Another great question. Thank you. Yes, you can. Once again, what we're planning to do is make sure that we're using some trail barricades and a trail close sign, but locating them such that there will be sort of not only isolating the work zone, but also just making sure that no one gets caught, if you will, at a dead end. So, for example, there'll be an opportunity to continue down from Hume Street on the trail, and there is a sort of a side trail, if you will, that goes into the residential neighborhood. So that would be accessible. So we would do work on the section between Morebay Park and that little side entrance, if you will. So that'll area be isolated. So you won't be able to access the actual work zone itself, that work zone proper. And so we'll just make an effort to place those trail barricades such that it makes it as convenient, as easy as possible for residents to continue to use the trail.
So we have a follow-up question to the one before this one. So could the trees be planted further back from the dike, perhaps along the industry along the side? It would be helpful to view when we're walking the trail. So the person is asking if we can plant trees on the side of the dike, maybe further back from the dike. Would you endorse this?
Well, I would say at this stage, I think it's certainly worth considering. And I think all ideas are to be put on the table these days. And so working with our forestry group and our ecologists like Dave is to sort of having that discussion. Our preference, however, or something we need to consider when it comes to the dike is that, as I mentioned, it's basically an earthen structure. We have this rock lining on top of it, and roots and tree roots and what have you managed to establish themselves and get themselves sort of well into this earth core. And so one of our concerns about some of these large trees, especially if they're at the toe of the slope, and even at midway up the slope, is that when these trees, if they do happen to fall over for whatever reason, age, wind, or what have you, that root ball that tends to come with a tree that falls now creates a hole in the dike. So it's these are just some things we have to consider. So our preference would be, to factor that into this idea. If there's some way that we can maybe establish some vegetation along the dike, I think was entertaining. I think Dave certainly mentioned, for example, as an ecologist training an engineer still, that it'd be things like the grasses, things like milkweed and other sort of grass species growing along the dike would certainly be favorable. That wouldn't interfere with the flood conveyance function, and it would contribute to certainly the wildlife habitat or pollinator habitat.
Stuart, did you also have a comment?
Hi there. Yeah, sorry, just turning on my microphone again. I just wanted to add to that question. It seemed like the question was almost pointing towards maybe trees on private property, if the town would endorse that. Currently, there is a community project going on right now in Collingwood called Canopy Collingwood Community Forest Project, and what it tries to achieve is gives Collingwood residents that are eligible 50% of the cost of planting trees on private property. Now, I believe this is only for residential residents. So whether or not it's within a condominium or within a freehold lot within town, I'm not sure if industries also qualify for that. But just wanted to add that if residents are, looking to plant trees on their private property, that's something else that the town does have a project available for that as well. So just thought I'd add that in, and I can maybe provide a link to that the canopy project in the comments as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. So someone in our Q&A wanted to comment that they wanted to emphasize that they really appreciate the flood protection aspect of this. They've just grown accustomed to the lovely greenery while walking on the trail.
Indeed. Yes, thank you. It certainly has become a very, I think, a valuable corridor for both the town and the NVCA. I don't think that the Stone Dust Trail was part of the original plan, if you will, back in the when it was originally built. But that's something that has evolved, and I think it seems from what we've seen, it's sort of very well used, and that's certainly encouraging.
Doug, did you want to comment?
Yeah, if I may, it's to the aspect of potentially partnering with neighboring property owners or with the industry. One thing that the NVCA is extremely good at is partnering with the community. So if there was a desire from industry, we would certainly entertain the conversation, respective of the parks planning and the Canopy Collingwood planning that's moving forward. But we would certainly entertain communicating with them if there was an interest. So just wanted to let you know that, Mark.
Thank you, Doug. How does climate change play a part in the Pretty River Dyke and its maintenance activities?
Did you want to start with that one, Dave? I can then chime in. How's that?
Yeah, sure, definitely can do that. Definitely with climate change, I think all models are pointing to greater extremes, so more extreme storm events. I know we had a pretty good one there late last week, but still not close to regulatory. However, there are suggestions that we all need to revisit our regulatory mapping based on the new storm projections coming out of climate change. So I think in view of this project, I think it's certainly puts more of a focus on maintaining that conveyance for the regulatory storm we have now, and hopefully prepare us for, we don't see it, but something that even bigger that might be on the horizon.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And just if I can add, when it comes to climate change, certainly the things that we are considering is when getting back to the tree planting, so recognizing that there's a number of different ways that we can try to adapt to climate change, and certainly the tree planting and recognizing the value that the trees have with respect to to that process. But the other interesting point too is that I suppose this also sort of ties in sort of the stormwater management aspects. And so when new developments come online in the area, that stormwater management is trying to control the runoff from those developments in such a way that it doesn't exacerbate the problem. But when certainly when it comes to the events as well, and there's an element of unpredictability when it comes to climate change that really sort of emphasizes the need for both Town of Collingwood as well as the NVCA to sort of have an element of preparedness, to be prepared for when this eventuality of these kind of floods. And so what makes last week's rain event and subsequent flood particularly interesting is that as I was sort of walking in the area and just keeping an eye on things last week and happened to be chatting to some residents, is that they were commenting that, oh my goodness, this kind of flood flows never happens in September. And that's this idea of unpredictability of storm events. And so you may have heard in the media that the storm events are going to become either more frequent or a bit more flashy or what have you. And it's that thing that we had to be prepared for. So the last flood event of that magnitude that we have seen since we were measuring water levels in the Pretty River occurred in March, interestingly enough, of 2016, in the so-called, what you might call the flood season. Whereas, and floods, if you will, in September are, essentially unheard of, but that's the kind of thing we had to be prepared for. So I think that's part of this, the function and the partnership between the town and the NVCA, that we're trying to sort of incorporate climate change into the work that we do.
Thank you, Mark. Dave, you had a comment?
Just very quickly, I think we'd be remiss as a watershed agency not to note the importance of watershed management or catchment management, not just in Collingwood, but upstream and up onto the escarpment,
Right.
making sure our natural infrastructure, our forest cover and wetlands remain intact and possibly even enhanced if that's possible to
Right.
help address climate change.
Well said, Dave. Thanks.
Why did you choose sections 4 and 5 to maintain first?
Yes, thank you. It's the maintain first, I think, is the catchphrase there. Is that just as a reminder here, the dike system, I don't think I was remiss in explaining it during the presentation, but you can see on the map there are sections that labeled as 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That is the entire stretch of the dike, just over 2 kilometers long. So there is a short section below or downstream of Pretty River Parkway. And then there's 3, 4, 5, and 6 are sections that are upstream of the Pretty River Parkway. But we're starting at 4 and 5 in particular, mainly because of ease of access to the slope from that stone dust trail. But another important section that we do need to get into is section 6. That's kind of the upstream section, furthest upstream section, but that's just a little bit more challenging to get into. So we're just trying to sort of start a project where we can and making an effort. And we have to clear both sides as well. We need to work both off of the trail side, and we need to get to the other side as well. So we've been granted access from the properties, the industrial and commercial properties on the east side, sorry. And so we do need to get access to both sides and clean them both out. But the overall intent is to get the entire section to a maintained condition.
Would you be able to show the map, please, just to give everybody a clear idea?
Okay, I'll see what I can do. So I'm just trying to share my screen. So there we go. So hopefully people can see this map. Can you see it, Maria?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So so here is the section, if you can see my pointer, down towards section 2 and 3 in the Pretty River Parkway, and then section 4 between the Parkway and Hume, 5 between Hume, and this is the side called the siding trail. So Moore Bay Park is right where my pointer is. And then section 6 goes from the siding trail bridge, the old rail bridge, and further upstream to this private driveway crossing here.
Thank you, Mark.